The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory as Morgan Quinn's horse galloped at full speed toward the sound. It was 1878, and the frontier was still wild enough that a gunshot could mean anything from a hunting party to a murder. What he found instead made his blood run cold. There, tied to a lone post near an abandoned cattle station, was a woman. Not just any woman, one with a swollen belly that indicated she was with child. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears, and a strip of cloth gagged her mouth. A broken wagon lay overturned nearby, its contents scattered. Morgan pulled his chestnut mare to a halt, dust swirling around them. His hand instinctively moved to his holster as he scanned the horizon for threats. Seeing none, he dismounted and approached cautiously. "Madam." "I'm going to help you," he said, his voice rough from days of little use. He'd been trailing a herd north and hadn't spoken to another soul in nearly a week. The woman's eyes widened with fear, then hope. She made muffled sounds behind her gag. Morgan drew his knife and quickly cut the gag. "Who did this to you, please?" she gasped, her voice hoarse. "They might come back. They took everything." Without another word, Morgan sliced through the ropes binding her wrists to the post. As they fell away, she nearly collapsed, and he caught her with strong arms. He noticed bruises forming on her wrists and a small cut above her eye. "I'm Morgan Quinn," he said, supporting her weight. "Can you tell me your name?" Josephine Harlow," she managed, one hand protectively covering her belly. "They ambushed me and my husband. They shot him." "I think he's dead." Morgan's jaw tightened. "Let's get you somewhere safe, Mrs. Harlow. Can you ride?" She nodded weakly. With careful movements, Morgan lifted her onto his horse, settling her in the saddle before mounting behind her. Her pregnant form made it awkward, but he managed to keep her secure against his chest as they rode away from the grim scene. "My ranch is about 4 hours north," he explained. "We'll get you water and rest along the way." Josephine leaned back against him, too exhausted to protest. Morgan could feel her trembling, and he wondered what horrors she had witnessed. Bandits were common in these parts, especially targeting vulnerable travelers, but leaving a pregnant woman tied to a post was a special kind of cruelty. "You know who they were?" he asked after they'd put some distance between them and the post. "3 men," she whispered. "They wore bandanas over their faces. One had a scar across his hand. They took our money, our supplies, even our wedding rings." Morgan nodded, filing away the description. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday afternoon. They left me there all night." Her voice cracked. "I thought I would die out there. My baby would have died too." "You're safe now," Morgan assured her, though he knew safety was relative in this unforgiving territory. They stopped at a creek where Morgan helped Josephine down and gave her water from his canteen. She drank greedily, then splashed some on her face, washing away tears and dirt. "How far along are you?" Morgan asked, gesturing to her belly. 7 months, I think. We were heading to Oregon. "David, my husband, had a brother there with land. We were going to start fresh." New tears welled in her eyes. "Now I don't know what I'll do." Morgan looked at this woman, alone and vulnerable in a harsh land. He'd seen too many tragedies in his 30 years, most during the war and the rest in this wild country. Something about her courage moved him. "You'll come to my ranch," he stated simply. "Stay until you're recovered and we figure out what's next." Josephine looked up at him, studying his face. Morgan knew what she saw: a weathered cowboy with a scar across his cheek from a cavalry saber, eyes that had witnessed too much death, and a week's worth of stubble. He wasn't much to look at, but he hoped she could see his honesty. "Why would you help me?" she asked softly. Morgan shrugged. "Out here, we help those who need it. Tomorrow it might be me needing the help." He paused. "Besides, I can't leave a woman and her unborn child to the mercy of this territory." They continued their journey as the sun climbed higher. Josephine began to tell him about her life. She was 23, married for 2 years to David Harlow, a carpenter by trade. They'd saved every penny for the journey west, dreaming of building a new life for their child. Morgan shared little in return, only that he'd fought for the Union, come west afterward. and managed to build a modest cattle operation with the help of 2 ranch hands. By mid-afternoon, they crested a hill, and Morgan's ranch came into view, a sturdy cabin with a barn and corral nestled against the foothills with a stream running nearby. It wasn't much compared to the grand ranches of Texas, but it was his, bought with hard work and determination. "Quinn," called a voice as they approached. A tall man emerged from the barn, hand on his pistol until he recognized Morgan. Was getting worried. "Who's this?" "Hank, this is Mrs. Harlow. She needs our help," Morgan explained, dismounting and helping Josephine down. "Mrs. Harlow, this is Hank Dempsey, my foreman." Hank's eyes widened at the sight of her condition, but he quickly composed himself. "Madam," he nodded respectfully, "let me help you inside." Between the 2 men, they got Josephine settled in Morgan's room, the only one with a proper bed. Morgan took the bunk in the small room where supplies were kept, insisting she take the better accommodation. That evening, they sat around the table while Hank's surprisingly good stew filled their bellies. The younger ranch hand, Tomas, had returned from checking the herd and was catching up on the day's events. "We should send word to Fort Laramie about those bandits," Hank suggested. "Army patrol might catch them." Morgan nodded. "I'll ride out tomorrow. Mrs. Harlow can describe them." "Please call me Josephine," she said quietly. "And thank you all for your kindness." That night, Morgan lay awake on his bunk, thinking about the woman sleeping in his bed. There was something about her quiet strength that stirred feelings he thought long buried after Annie died during the war. He'd loved once and lost everything. He wasn't looking to do it again. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Josephine, not romantic, he told himself, just protective. She needed someone to look out for her, especially now. The next morning, Josephine emerged from his room looking better after a night's rest. Hank had found her some clean clothes that belonged to his sister, who visited occasionally. They were a bit large but better than her torn dress. "I need to bury my husband," she said firmly as Morgan poured her coffee. Morgan met her gaze. "We don't know if he survived, Mrs. Josephine. I saw him fall. There was so much blood." Her hands shook slightly. "Even if by some miracle he lived, he doesn't know where I am." "I need to go back." Morgan understood the need for closure. "I'll take you there. But first, we need to report the attack to the authorities." Over the next 2 days, they rode to Fort Laramie, where Josephine gave her statement to the commander. The officer promised to send men to investigate, but offered little hope of finding the bandits or recovering her possessions. On the 3rd day, Morgan, Josephine, and Hank rode to the scene of the attack. The overturned wagon remained, picked clean by scavengers. A few yards away, they found what they feared, the body of David Harlow, partially covered by brush. Josephine wept silently as Morgan and Hank dug a grave. They fashioned a crude cross from wagon pieces, and Josephine said a prayer over her husband's final resting place. "He was a good man," she said afterward. "He was so excited about becoming a father." The ride back to the ranch was solemn. Morgan watched Josephine from the corner of his eye, concerned about how the stress might affect her pregnancy. "You can stay at the ranch as long as you need," he offered. "At least until after the baby comes," Josephine nodded, her hand resting on her belly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No need for repayment, it's what neighbors do." Weeks passed, and Josephine became a fixture at the Quinn ranch. She took over cooking duties despite Morgan's protests that she should rest, saying that idleness only left her with dark thoughts. The men certainly didn't complain about having decent meals instead of Hank's limited repertoire. Morgan found himself looking forward to evenings when they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Josephine would share stories of her childhood in Illinois, and occasionally Morgan would open up about his own past, his family farm in Pennsylvania, his time in the war, and his journey west seeking solitude and purpose. "Why did you never marry?" Josephine asked one evening as they sat shelling peas. Morgan's hands stilled. "I was engaged once. Her name was Annie. She died of typhoid while I was fighting at Gettysburg." Josephine's hand covered his briefly. "I'm sorry." It was a long time ago, but the pain in his voice betrayed him. "Does it ever stop hurting?" she asked, and he knew she was thinking of David. "Not entirely. But eventually, you start having days when you don't think about it first thing in the morning." As her pregnancy advanced, Morgan worried about the lack of proper medical care. The nearest doctor was in Laramie, a full day's ride away. He sent Tomas to fetch a midwife from the small settlement 15 miles east, an older Cheyenne woman named Sarah II Stars, who had delivered most of the babies in the region. Sarah arrived and inspected Josephine, declaring both mother and baby healthy but warning that the birth could come any day. She agreed to stay at the ranch until the baby arrived, sleeping in the small room with Josephine while Morgan moved to the barn loft. One evening in late October, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled around the cabin and rain pounded the roof. Morgan was checking on the horses when he heard a scream from the house. He rushed inside to find Josephine doubled over, clutching her belly. Sarah was already at her side, speaking in calm, measured tones. "The baby comes," the midwife announced. "Out, men. This is women's work." Morgan and his men retreated to the barn, where they paced anxiously as Josephine's cries occasionally pierced the storm's noise. Hours passed, and Morgan found himself praying for the first time in years. Near dawn, as the storm finally subsided, the cabin door opened. Sarah stood there, exhausted but smiling. "A girl," she announced. "Strong and healthy, mother too." Morgan felt relief wash over him. He waited until Sarah nodded permission before entering the cabin. Josephine lay in bed, her face pale but radiant as she cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Morgan's cleanest shirts. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression made his heart skip. "Would you like to meet her?" Josephine asked softly. Morgan approached cautiously, as if the baby were made of porcelain. When Josephine tilted the bundle, he saw a tiny face with a dusting of dark hair and rosebud lips. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Have you named her?" "I'm thinking of calling her Hope." Josephine smiled down at her daughter. "Because that's what she gives me." Morgan nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd helped deliver calves and foals, but nothing had prepared him for the wave of emotion at seeing this tiny human who had fought her way into the world during a howling storm. Over the next weeks, Morgan found reasons to be in the cabin more often. He carved a cradle from pine, lined it with soft rabbit fur, and hung a small mobile of wooden stars above it. He caught Hank and Tomas making faces at the baby when they thought no one was looking. Winter settled over the ranch, snow blanketing the landscape. The isolation that Morgan had once cherished now seemed like a blessing for different reasons. The small cabin became a warm sanctuary for their unlikely family. One evening, as Josephine nursed Hope by the fire, Morgan realized with sudden clarity that he didn't want them to leave ever. The thought startled him. When had he started thinking of them as more than guests in need? "What will you do when spring comes?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Josephine looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "I haven't thought that far ahead. I should continue to Oregon, I suppose." "David's brother would take us in." Morgan nodded, feeling a cold weight settle in his chest. "Of course. That makes sense." Later that night, unable to sleep, Morgan stood outside watching the stars. The thought of the cabin without Josephine's laugh or Hope's coos left him feeling hollow. "You should be inside where it's warm," Josephine's voice came from behind him. She had wrapped herself in a blanket, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Just thinking," he replied. "About what?" Morgan hesitated. "About how quiet it will be when you and Hope leave." Josephine stepped closer. "Is that what you want, for us to leave?" "No," he admitted, the word barely audible, "but I never expected you to stay." "What if I wanted to?" Her eyes reflected the starlight. Morgan turned to face her fully. "This is a hard life, Josephine, isolated, demanding." "Not what you planned. Plans change." She reached out, her hand finding his. "Hope deserves a father, a good man who will teach her strength and kindness." Morgan's heart raced. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've grown to care for you, Morgan Quinn. More than I thought possible after losing David." He looked down at their joined hands. "I've been alone a long time. I'm not sure I remember how not to be." "You've done a fine job so far," she said with a small smile. "The way you look at Hope, that's how a father looks at his daughter." Morgan knew she was right. He had fallen in love with the baby girl as surely as he had fallen for her mother. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. "I don't want to replace David," he said carefully. "You couldn't, just as I couldn't replace Annie." Josephine squeezed his hand. "But perhaps we can build something new together." Morgan reached out, gently touching her cheek. "I'd like that, Josephine, very much." Their first kiss was tentative, a question rather than a declaration. When they broke apart, Josephine's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "We should go inside," Morgan whispered. "Hope will be waking for her feeding soon." Over the winter months, their relationship deepened. Morgan formally asked Josephine to marry him on Christmas morning, presenting her with a simple silver ring he'd ridden through a snowstorm to purchase in Laramie. They were married in early spring by a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch. Hank and Tomas stood as witnesses, and even Sarah, 2 stars, came for the occasion, holding Hope throughout the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Morgan thought about the strange path that had led him to this moment, how finding a woman tied to a post had changed everything. He had cut her ropes and lifted her to his horse, never imagining he was also lifting himself out of years of loneliness. That night, as husband and wife, they lay together talking about the future. Morgan spoke of expanding the ranch, building a bigger house. Josephine shared her dreams of maybe having more children, of teaching Hope to read and write. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Josephine confessed, her head on his chest. "When those men left me tied to that post, I thought it was the end." "Instead, it was a beginning," Morgan said, kissing her forehead. By summer, news came that the army had captured the bandits who had attacked Josephine and killed David. They would face justice for their crimes. The wedding rings and other personal items were recovered and returned. Josephine kept David's ring in a small box as a keepsake for Hope, a connection to her birth father. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm. Hope grew from a newborn to a curious infant who delighted in watching the horses from the safety of her mother's arms. Josephine planted a garden and started selling preserves to passing travelers. Morgan added 20 head of cattle to his herd and began planning for a larger home. 1 year to the day after Morgan had found Josephine, they stood together at the site where he had cut her free. They had ridden out alone, leaving Hope with Hank and his sister who was visiting. "I wanted to come back here," Josephine explained, "to remember how close I came to losing everything and how instead I found a new life." Morgan dismounted and helped her down from her horse. They stood together, the wind rustling the prairie grass around them. "I think about it sometimes," Morgan admitted. "What if I hadn't heard that gunshot? What if I'd ridden in a different direction?" Josephine leaned against him. "I believe we were meant to find each other. After all we've both lost, perhaps we deserve to find something too." Morgan wrapped his arm around her waist. "I thank God every day that I found you, even if the circumstances were grim. And I thank God you were brave enough to stop." She turned in his arms. "There's something I need to tell you." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Hope is going to have a sibling," Josephine said, her eyes bright with happiness. "In about 7 months." Joy surged through Morgan. He lifted Josephine off her feet in a gentle embrace, mindful of her condition. "Are you certain?" "Sarah confirmed it yesterday when she visited. I wanted to tell you here where our story began." Morgan kissed her deeply, then set her down. "Let's go home, Mrs. Quinn. We have a nursery to prepare." As they rode back toward the ranch, side by side this time rather than with her rescued and clinging to life, Morgan reflected on how the worst day of Josephine's life had led to this new beginning for both of them. The tragedy that had brought them together had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. In December 1879, Josephine gave birth to a son they named Matthew David Quinn. Hope, now a toddler, was fascinated by her baby brother, constantly wanting to touch his tiny fingers and toes. By the time Matthew was born, The new house was finished a proper two-story home with enough bedrooms for their growing family. Morgan had hired additional hands to help with the expanding ranch, and Josephine had started a small school for the children of nearby homesteaders. 5 years after Morgan had found Josephine tied to that post, their ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the territory. They had added another daughter to their family, little Emma, and Hope had grown into a thoughtful, bright 7-year-old who loved helping her father with the horses. On the anniversary of their meeting, now a private holiday for them, Morgan and Josephine always rode out alone to the spot where he had found her. This time, they brought a sapling to plant a living marker of their beginning. "I used to wonder if I would ever feel joy again after David died," Josephine said as they patted soil around the young tree. "Now I can hardly remember what it feels like to be that broken." Morgan pulled her close. "Every time I look at you and our children, I'm grateful for whatever twist of fate put me on that trail that day." "Our children," Josephine repeated with a smile. She still honored Hope's birth father's memory, but Morgan had been the only father the girl had ever known, and his love for her was as deep as for his biological children. "When I cut those ropes and lifted you onto my horse, I had no idea I was rescuing my own heart in the process," Morgan said, kissing her softly. As they rode home together, the setting sun gilding the prairie, Morgan thought about how life's darkest moments sometimes led to its greatest blessings. What had begun as an act of basic human decency helping a woman in desperate need had blossomed into a love that had healed them both. The ranch appeared on the horizon, smoke curling from the chimney, their children waiting with the housekeeper they'd hired after Emma was born. It was everything Morgan had never dared to dream of having again after the war took so much from him. Josephine reached over and took his hand as they rode. "Thank you for cutting my ropes that day," she said simply. Morgan squeezed her hand in return. "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep riding forward." Together they returned to the home they had built, not just the physical structure, but the family and love that filled it, a testament to the unexpected gifts that could arise from even the most desperate circumstances on the wild frontier.